Shortly after midnight, multiple Israeli airbases came under coordinated strike pressure from different vectors at once. Not a single wave. Layered timing, ballistic trajectories descending at high velocity, cruise missiles approaching low and fast beneath radar coverage, and behind them, slower drone formations designed to stretch defensive response windows. Within minutes, the pattern became clear. This was not a probing attack. It was synchronized. Nevatim, Tel Nof, Ramon. Three of the most critical nodes in Israel's airpower network were all hit within the same operational window. Runways were the first priority. Precision-guided munitions targeted runway intersections, not random impact points, but the exact sections required for sustained sortie generation. Follow-on strikes hit hardened aircraft shelters, maintenance zones, and fuel storage areas. The objective was not visibility. It was interruption. And in the first hour, that interruption began to take hold. If you follow conflicts at the level where systems matter more than headlines, this is the point where the story actually begins, not with what exploded, but with what stopped working. Because Israel's air power is not defined by how many aircraft sit on the ground. It is defined by how quickly those aircraft can be launched, recovered, refueled, rearmed, and sent back into the air. That entire cycle depends on infrastructure functioning without delay. And those dependencies came under pressure immediately. Initial impact assessments showed runway cratering at multiple locations, forcing temporary closures and rapid deployment of repair teams. Specialized crews moved in within minutes, working to fill, seal, and reinforce damaged sections under the assumption that additional strikes could follow. But repair under threat is not the same as repair under control. Every minute a runway remains unavailable reduces sortie generation capacity. And that reduction compounds. Aircraft scheduled for launch begin to stack on the ground. Mission timing slips. Air coverage windows narrow. The aircraft themselves may remain intact, but the system that allows them to operate begins to slow. And that distinction matters more than it first appears. Because modern air power is not about possession. It is about tempo, how many sorties can be generated per hour, how quickly aircraft can be turned between missions, how consistently coverage can be maintained across multiple fronts. Once that tempo is disrupted, even temporarily, the effect is not linear. It cascades. Fuel trucks cannot move efficiently across damaged surfaces. Maintenance crews are forced to reroute or delay inspections. Ordnance loading schedules begin to slip. And each delay feeds into the next. At Nevatim, one of the primary bases supporting advanced aircraft operations, the pressure was particularly concentrated. Runway intersections critical for flexible takeoff and landing patterns were among the first targets, limiting operational redundancy. At Tel Nof, infrastructure tied to rapid deployment cycles came under similar strain. And at Ramon, where strategic positioning allows for broader regional reach, disruption introduced uncertainty into mission planning. Individually, each disruption could be managed. Collectively, they begin to interact. That interaction is where the system becomes fragile. Because airbases are not isolated assets, they function as interconnected nodes within a larger operational network. Aircraft move between them. Support flows across them. Command decisions depend on their reliability. When multiple nodes are hit simultaneously, the network loses flexibility. Options narrow. Commanders are forced to prioritize which missions proceed, which are delayed, which are reassigned. And those decisions are made under time pressure. Not because aircraft are gone, but because the system that sustains them has been interrupted. And that is the shift that matters. Because once the focus moves from destruction to disruption, the question changes. It is no longer about how much damage was done. It is about how long the system can continue to function under strain. Because even partial degradation, if sustained long enough, produces effects that look very similar to loss. Aircraft grounded, coverage gaps widening, response times increasing, not all at once, but enough to be felt. And once that happens, the pressure does not remain confined to the airbases themselves. It begins to move outward into the wider structure that depends on them. The visible damage sat on the surface, craters in concrete, scorched sections of tarmac, disrupted access routes, but the real pressure was not in what was destroyed. It was in what those locations actually do. An airbase is not a parking area for aircraft. It is a continuous operating system. Every sortie depends on a sequence that must hold together without interruption. Aircraft land. They are inspected. They are refueled. They are rearmed. They are cleared. They launch again. That cycle repeats hour after hour. Break any one part of that chain, and the entire tempo begins to slow. And tempo is the core of air power, not inventory. A fleet on the ground does not project power. A fleet in motion does. That motion depends on infrastructure that is often overlooked because it functions quietly until it doesn't. Runways are the most visible element, but they are only one part. Taxiways determine how quickly aircraft can move between landing and staging zones. Fuel systems determine whether refueling can occur at speed or must be staggered. Ordnance handling areas control how efficiently weapons can be loaded. Maintenance bays are where the real constraint begins to appear. Modern aircraft, especially advanced platforms, do not operate without constant inspection cycles. Turnaround times are measured carefully. Even small delays accumulate. If maintenance teams are forced to reroute, compress timelines, or operate under degraded conditions, reliability begins to drop. And reliability feeds directly into sortie generation, because commanders do not schedule aircraft that cannot be trusted to perform. So aircraft begin to sit, not because they are damaged, but because the system that certifies them for flight is under strain, and that distinction is where the operational picture changes. Fuel adds another layer. Airbases rely on continuous fuel flow storage, distribution, delivery. Damage to fuel depots or transfer systems does not always create immediate shortages. But it introduces friction. Fuel trucks must take longer routes. Refueling operations slow. Queues form. Each delay feeds into the next stage of the cycle. A delay in refueling becomes a delay in rearming. A delay in rearming becomes a delay in launch. And once launches begin to slip, coverage patterns change. Aircraft are no longer where they are expected to be when they are expected to be there. That creates gaps. Not necessarily visible from a distance, but very real in operational planning. And those gaps are what adversaries look for. Because air power is not only about striking targets. It is about maintaining presence, constant coverage, predictable response windows, reliable interception capability. Once that predictability weakens, uncertainty enters the system. And uncertainty forces more conservative decisions. Fewer sorties, tighter prioritization, reduced operational flexibility. At that point, even if the aircraft themselves remain intact, the effective capacity of the Air Force begins to decline. Not sharply, but steadily. And that steady decline is harder to counter than a sudden loss, because it is less visible. Command structures begin to adjust. Resources are reallocated. Some bases may take on additional load, increasing strain across the network. Others may temporarily reduce operations to stabilize internal systems. That redistribution introduces new pressure points, because the system was not designed to operate indefinitely under uneven load. And once that imbalance appears, the effects begin to compound. Sortie rates drop. Maintenance cycles stretch. Operational planning becomes more constrained. And over time, the distinction between fully operational and degraded begins to blur. Which leads to a more difficult question. If the aircraft are still there, but the system that sustains them is slowing down, at what point does capacity loss become indistinguishable from capability loss? Because that is where the structure reveals itself. Air power is not defined by what exists on paper. It is defined by what can be generated, sustained, and repeated in real time. And once that generation cycle begins to stall, the pressure does not stay contained. It begins to interact with the defenses that were supposed to prevent this in the first place. The immediate question that follows is not about damage. It is about access. Because for strikes of this scale to reach multiple airbases within the same operational window, something in the defensive structure had to give. Not collapse entirely, but bend under pressure. Israel's air defense architecture is layered by design. Short-range systems handle rockets and drones. Mid-range systems engage cruise missiles. Long-range systems are tasked with ballistic threats. Each layer is built to absorb a specific category of incoming pressure. But the system is not designed for infinite load. And that is where the mechanism begins. A saturation attack does not aim to defeat defenses one target at a time. It aims to exceed the system's capacity to respond. Ballistic missiles arrive first fast, high altitude, limited reaction time. They force immediate allocation of long-range interceptors. At the same time, cruise missiles approach along low-altitude paths using terrain and flight profiles that reduce detection windows. And behind them, drones move more slowly but in greater numbers, forcing additional tracking and engagement decisions. The effect is not just volume, it is sequencing. Different threat types arriving at slightly offset intervals force the defense system to remain continuously engaged without reset. Interceptors are launched. Radar systems track multiple vectors simultaneously. Command systems prioritize threats based on projected impact points. And under that load, prioritization becomes the critical constraint. Not every incoming object can be engaged. Some are intercepted. Others are allowed through based on calculated risk. That is not failure. It is design. But under saturation, those calculations become more difficult because the system is forced to make decisions faster with less margin for error. Decoys add another layer. Objects designed to mimic the radar signature or flight behavior of actual threats force additional intercept attempts. Each interceptor launched carries cost financial, logistical, and operational. And once interceptors begin to deplete, the system's flexibility narrows. This is where asymmetry becomes visible. An interceptor missile can cost several times more than the object it is attempting to destroy. That imbalance does not matter in isolated engagements, but under sustained pressure, it accumulates. Inventory matters. Reload times matter. Launcher availability matters. And once those constraints begin to tighten, the defense system shifts from full coverage to selective coverage. That shift is subtle at first. A slightly delayed engagement, a missed intercept window, a decision to prioritize one target over another. But over time, those small gaps begin to align. And when they do, access opens. Not everywhere, but in enough places to matter. At that point, the strike transitions from attempted penetration to partial success. And that is all it needs. Because the objective is not to overwhelm every defensive layer completely. It is to create enough openings at enough critical locations within a short enough time frame to disrupt the system behind them. This is where the contradiction begins to take shape. Israel maintains one of the most advanced air defense networks in the world. Layered, integrated, battle-tested. And yet, under certain conditions, even that architecture can be stretched. Not broken in a single moment, but pressured across multiple dimensions at once. Speed, volume, direction, timing, each manageable on its own, difficult when combined. And once that combination is achieved, the defensive advantage begins to narrow. Because defenses are reactive. They respond. But the structure of the attack determines the sequence of that response. And if the sequence is controlled externally, the defender is always one step behind. That does not mean defenses fail entirely. It means they are forced into trade-offs. Protect this target or that one. Engage this threat now or hold for a potentially more dangerous 1 second later. And those decisions are made in compressed time frames. Milliseconds. Seconds. With incomplete information, that is the environment saturation creates, not chaos. Pressure. And under sustained pressure, even highly capable systems begin to show limits. Because no defensive architecture is designed for perfect interception. It is designed for acceptable risk. But when acceptable risk accumulates across multiple vectors, it stops looking acceptable. And that is where the deeper issue emerges. Because if airbases can be reached under those conditions, then the question is no longer about whether defenses exist. It is about whether they can hold at scale. And that is where the structure of the conflict begins to shift in a way that is harder to reverse. Once the pressure reaches this point, the question shifts again. Not what was hit, not how it was hit, but what changes as a result. Because disruption at the airbase level does not remain contained. It moves outward into operational planning, regional posture, and strategic signaling. The first effect is tempo. Sortie generation begins to slow. Not uniformly, not across every base at the same rate, but enough to force adjustments. Fewer aircraft available per hour, longer turnaround times between missions, reduced flexibility in scheduling. And once tempo drops, coverage changes. Airspace that was previously maintained under continuous presence begins to thin. Response windows extend. That does not create immediate vulnerability, but it introduces timing gaps. And timing gaps are where pressure accumulates, because adversaries do not need complete absence of coverage. They need predictability to weaken. The second effect is prioritization. Command structures are forced to decide which missions proceed at full capacity and which are scaled back. Air defense missions may take precedence over strike operations. Strategic targets may be deferred in favor of maintaining baseline coverage. Each decision reallocates pressure elsewhere, because every resource assigned to one function is unavailable for another, and that redistribution compounds over time. The third effect is signaling, not through statements. Through observable behavior, reduced sortie rates are visible. Delayed responses are measurable. Shifts in operational patterns are tracked, and those signals are interpreted regionally by allies, by adversaries, and by actors watching for shifts in balance. This is where escalation risk begins to expand, because once a system shows signs of strain, it invites testing. Not necessarily immediate escalation, but probing. Additional pressure applied at different points. New vectors introduced to see how the system responds. And each test forces another allocation decision. That cycle can stabilize, or it can accelerate. That depends on duration, which leads to three possible paths. The first is temporary disruption. Runways are repaired within hours. Operations resume near baseline levels. The system absorbs the shock and rebalances. In this scenario, the strike is significant but contained. The second is sustained degradation. Repairs take longer. Follow-on pressure prevents full recovery. Sortie rates remain below optimal levels for an extended period. In this case, the system continues to function, but at reduced efficiency, and that reduction affects every layer above it. The third is escalation. Not necessarily immediate, but structural. Additional strikes, expanded engagement zones, broader involvement. At that point, the conflict shifts in character, because the focus moves from isolated disruption to sustained pressure across multiple systems, airbases, logistics, command structures, each becoming part of a wider operational equation. And once that shift occurs, recovery becomes more complex, because systems under continuous pressure cannot fully reset. They adapt. But adaptation under strain carries cost. Maintenance cycles shorten, equipment wear increases, decision margins narrow, and those effects accumulate. Which brings the situation back to its central contradiction. Air superiority, in theory, remains intact. The aircraft exist. The pilots are trained. The capability is still present. But the ability to generate that capability consistently begins to weaken. And in operational terms, consistency matters more than potential. Because air power is not judged by what could be deployed. It is judged by what can be deployed on time, every time. Once that reliability begins to slip, even slightly, the structure underneath becomes visible. Not as collapse, but as strain. And strain, if sustained, tends to reveal where the next pressure point will emerge. Because the system does not fail all at once. It shifts. And once it shifts, the next phase is no longer defined by what just happened, but by what that shift now makes possible.